He was the kind of person most people passed by without a second thought, not because he lacked presence, but because the environment around him had trained everyone to ignore people in his position, to reduce them to a role instead of seeing them as individuals with depth, history, and untold capability. Each day he arrived early, before the offices filled with voices and footsteps, and he moved through the building with a quiet rhythm that matched the routine of his tasks, carrying tools, emptying bins, wiping surfaces until they reflected the overhead lights, creating order in spaces that others would later occupy, without ever considering the effort behind that cleanliness. People who worked in the building recognized him only in fragments, a nod in the hallway, a brief exchange about timing or access, rarely anything that went beyond function, and in those fleeting interactions there was little curiosity about who he was beyond the uniform and the job title attached to it. To them, he blended into the background, another part of the structure that made their workplace run smoothly, not someone whose inner world might hold interests, skills, or passions that existed outside the boundaries they had unconsciously assigned. There was a kind of quiet invisibility in that, not imposed by his absence of expression, but created by the assumptions others carried with them, assumptions that shaped how they looked at him, how they spoke around him, and how they never quite thought to look closer. He moved through those assumptions daily, aware in a subtle way that he was seen but not truly seen, acknowledged but not understood, and yet he continued his work with consistency, not seeking recognition, but simply fulfilling the responsibilities he had taken on, maintaining a steady presence that required no validation from those around him. In the shared spaces of the building, where conversations about meetings, decisions, and plans filled the air, he remained on the edges of attention, present but uninvited into the deeper layers of interaction that others freely accessed, and over time that distance became normalized, as if it were the natural order of things rather than something shaped by perspective and habit. Even as he passed by open doors where discussions took place, or paused briefly in hallways while others moved past him, there was little indication from either side that his identity extended beyond the role he was visibly performing, and that unspoken boundary reinforced itself with every repeated encounter. Yet beneath that surface of quiet routine, there existed a life shaped by experiences not visible in the context of his daily tasks, a life that carried its own rhythms, memories, and perhaps a familiarity with something far removed from the expectations placed upon him in that building, something that remained undisclosed because no one had asked and no situation had required it to surface. It did not begin with intention or respect, but rather with the kind of offhand suggestion that often arises in rooms where people feel comfortable enough to speak without considering the weight of their words, a moment where curiosity is mixed with amusement and assumptions fill in the gaps of what is not known. Someone, in a tone that carried a hint of humor and casual challenge, turned their attention toward him and suggested that he play something on the piano, not because they had reason to believe in his ability, but because the idea itself seemed unexpected enough to entertain the group for a brief moment. There was no careful invitation, no genuine effort to understand whether he had ever played, no acknowledgement of the possibility that such a request might reveal something meaningful, only the sense that it would be interesting to see what happened if the quiet janitor stepped outside the role everyone associated him with. In that setting, the suggestion was framed as lighthearted, a kind of spontaneous experiment meant to pass the time rather than a sincere request, and the tone of the room reflected that attitude, with subtle smiles and glances exchanged among those present, as if anticipating an outcome that would confirm their expectations rather than challenge them. The piano itself stood as a familiar object in the space, often associated with gatherings, events, or moments of performance. Yet in this instance it became the center of a request that was less about music and more about perception, a test that no one explicitly defined, but everyone seemed to understand in their own way. The expectation was unspoken but present, a shared assumption that he would either decline or produce something unremarkable, reinforcing the idea that his identity did not extend into the realm of performance or artistic expression in a way that would surprise them. In asking him to play, They were not just requesting a song, but subtly projecting their own beliefs about what someone in his position was likely capable of, shaping the moment into something that reflected their perspective rather than his reality. The atmosphere around the request carried an undercurrent of casual dismissal, not openly disrespectful, but lacking the depth of consideration that would accompany a genuine invitation. And within that space, the act of asking became more about the observers than the individual being asked. For them, it was an opportunity to witness something outside the ordinary flow of their day, a brief deviation from routine that required no investment beyond attention. And in that sense, the request was less about inclusion and more about curiosity framed as entertainment. The phrasing, the timing, and the tone all contributed to a moment that appeared simple on the surface, but was layered with unspoken assumptions about roles, expectations, and the boundaries placed around people based on how they were initially perceived. No one in the room paused to consider the implications of what they were asking, how it might feel to be placed in that position, or what it would mean if the outcome defied their quiet predictions, because the moment was treated as inconsequential, a passing idea rather than something that might carry deeper significance. He did not react in a way that matched the room's quiet expectations. There was no visible hesitation that suggested uncertainty, nor any attempt to deflect or excuse himself from the moment that had been placed in front of him. Instead, he carried himself with a composure that seemed to come from a place of familiarity rather than pressure, as though the request, however casual or unintended it may have been, did not disrupt his sense of self or his understanding of what he was capable of. As he stepped forward, his movements were steady and unhurried, each step deliberate without drawing unnecessary attention. And in that calm approach, there was a subtle shift that began to register in those who were watching, a realization that his response did not align with the anticipation they had built around the situation. The atmosphere, which had carried a tone of light amusement moments earlier, started to settle into something more attentive, not because anyone had consciously decided to change their demeanor, but because his presence in that moment carried a quiet assurance that invited focus rather than distraction. When he reached the piano, he did not pause in a way that signaled doubt or hesitation, nor did he look around for validation or approval. Instead, he positioned himself with a natural ease that suggested familiarity with the instrument, as though the act of sitting before it was not something new or foreign, but something that belonged within his experience. His posture reflected a balance of comfort and readiness, hands resting near the keys with a measured stillness that indicated he was not rushing into the moment, but rather settling into it, allowing the space around him to adjust to his presence rather than the other way around. There was no need for him to announce his intentions verbally, no explanation offered to justify why he might or might not be able to play, because his demeanor itself communicated a quiet confidence that stood apart from the expectations placed upon him. In that brief interval before any sound was made, his composure became the defining element of the scene, shaping how the room perceived what was about to unfold, and gradually replacing the earlier sense of casual curiosity with a more focused and observant silence. The confidence he displayed was not loud or performative. It did not seek to impress or draw attention through exaggerated gestures, but instead presented itself through restraint, through the absence of uncertainty in his movements, and through the steady way he positioned himself in front of the instrument as if he understood it not just physically but intuitively. Those watching began to adjust their perception in subtle ways, noticing details they had not considered before, such as the ease with which he settled into place and the lack of any visible tension in his posture. And in those details, the assumption that he was simply out of his depth began to weaken. His calmness did not arise from indifference, but from a sense of readiness that did not require external validation, a readiness that suggested he had engaged with this kind of moment before, whether in private or in a different context altogether, and that familiarity translated into a quiet authority in the way he carried himself. When his fingers finally touched the keys, the shift in the room became immediate and unmistakable, as if the air itself had adjusted to accommodate something that no one had anticipated. and what began as a casual moment quickly transformed into a space defined by sound, rhythm, and expression that carried far more depth than the setting had prepared them for. The first notes did not arrive with hesitation or uncertainty. They emerged with clarity and control, each tone placed with intention, revealing a level of familiarity with the instrument that contradicted every assumption that had been made up to that point. His hands moved across the keyboard with a balance of precision and fluidity, not rushed, not mechanical, but guided by an internal understanding of timing and flow that allowed the music to unfold naturally, as though the piece was not being performed for others, but rather being expressed from within. As the sequence of notes continued, patterns began to form that reflected structure and discipline, suggesting that what they were hearing was not accidental or improvised without grounding, but rooted in practice, repetition, and an understanding of musical language that extended beyond surface-level familiarity. The coordination between his left and right hand showed a clear awareness of harmony and balance, with one hand carrying the foundation while the other introduced movement and variation, creating layers that blended into a cohesive sound rather than a collection of isolated notes. The dynamics of his playing shifted subtly as the piece progressed, moving between softer passages that required control and restraint, and stronger accents that added emphasis and emotion, demonstrating not only technical ability, but also sensitivity to how music can guide the listener's attention and feeling. Each transition was handled with ease, without abruptness or disruption, indicating a command over timing and phrasing that allowed the music to breathe rather than feel confined. Those observing began to recognize that what they were hearing was not limited to mechanical skill, but reflected an understanding of expression, where tempo, intensity, and articulation were used intentionally to shape the experience of the listener. His ability to maintain consistency throughout the performance suggested endurance and focus, qualities that often come from sustained engagement with the instrument over time, and the absence of visible struggle in his execution reinforced the impression that this was not unfamiliar territory for him. The notes resonated through the space with clarity, filling the room in a way that made it difficult to ignore the depth of what was being played, and gradually the attention of those present shifted entirely toward the sound, as the music began to take precedence over any prior assumptions or expectations they had carried into the moment. The structure of his performance, whether simple or complex in composition, carried a sense of coherence that allowed listeners to follow its progression without confusion, and within that coherence there was a subtle richness that came from the way he balanced repetition with variation, familiarity with surprise. As the music continued to unfold, the atmosphere in the room began to change in a way that was not immediate in words but unmistakable in behavior, as the quiet hum of casual presence gave way to a focused stillness that seemed to settle over everyone at once. Conversations that had been occurring in the background ceased without formal acknowledgement, and small gestures that once signaled distraction, such as glances at phones or side remarks, gradually disappeared as attention converged on the source of the sound. What had begun as a moment treated lightly was now being experienced with a level of presence that required no instruction, because the nature of the performance itself drew people inward, holding their focus in a way that felt natural rather than imposed. The expressions in the room began to shift subtly, with brows softening, heads turning fully toward the piano, and postures adjusting as individuals leaned slightly forward or settled into a more attentive stance, indicating that their engagement had moved beyond passive observation into something more absorbing. The earlier tone of amusement, which had lingered at the edges of the interaction, was no longer visible, replaced instead by a kind of quiet acknowledgement that something unexpected was taking place. The room, which had moments before felt open and conversational, now carried a shared silence that was not empty but filled with concentration, as if everyone present had collectively agreed, without speaking, that the moment deserved their full attention. Even those who had initially approached the situation with light curiosity found themselves drawn into the continuity of the performance, their expectations reshaped by the unfolding reality of what they were hearing. The music acted as a focal point, organizing the energy of the space around it, guiding the rhythm of the room in a way that was subtle yet undeniable. Small movements that might normally go unnoticed became more deliberate, such as the way someone shifted in their seat or clasped their hands, reflecting an unconscious alignment with the tone that had been established. The absence of side conversations allowed the sound to resonate more clearly, giving each note room to be heard without interference. And in that clarity, the details of the performance became more pronounced. People began to listen not just with their ears, but with their full attention, following the flow of the piece, anticipating transitions, and responding internally to changes in tempo and intensity. The collective silence carried a sense of respect that had not been present at the start, emerging naturally as the performance revealed its depth. And in that shared stillness, the room felt unified in a way that transcended the individual roles or assumptions that had defined it moments earlier. The environment itself seemed to adapt to the presence of the music, with the acoustics of the space becoming more noticeable, the distance between individuals less relevant than the shared experience they were all part of, and the boundaries between observer and participant subtly blurred as everyone became equally engaged in the moment. Even the CEO, who had entered the room carrying the quiet confidence of authority and the familiarity of being in control of the environment, found himself drawn into a moment that did not respond to titles or hierarchy, as the sound coming from the piano carried a weight that stood apart from status or position and reached him in a way that was unexpected yet undeniable. His attention, which was often divided across responsibilities, decisions, and the subtle awareness of overseeing those around him, became fully fixed on the performance, as the unfolding music created a space where everything else seemed to recede into the background. There was a shift in his expression that occurred gradually rather than abruptly, his posture easing slightly as the layers of formality that typically accompanied his role gave way to a more human response to what he was hearing, reflecting a recognition that this moment did not require leadership or oversight, but simply presence. As the notes continued, he remained still, not out of obligation, but out of genuine engagement, allowing the performance to guide his focus without interruption. In that stillness, the distance between his position and the person at the piano seemed to narrow, not physically, but in a way that altered perception, as the music created a shared experience that did not distinguish between roles or titles. The realization that the individual playing the piano was the same person who had been overlooked moments earlier began to take shape in his mind, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet correction of assumption, something that challenged the initial perception without needing to be spoken aloud. The emotional impact of the performance did not manifest in an exaggerated or immediate reaction, but rather in subtle signs that revealed a deeper internal response, such as a softened gaze, a momentary pause in movement, and a stillness that suggested reflection rather than evaluation. The music seemed to reach beyond technical appreciation and into a space that evoked a sense of respect, not just for the skill being demonstrated, but for the contrast between expectation and reality that had unfolded in front of him. As someone accustomed to making judgments based on information, observation, and experience, the CEO found himself in a position where the information he had initially relied upon was incomplete, and the performance served as a reminder that ability and identity are not always aligned with outward appearances or assigned roles. The weight of that realization was not expressed in words, but it was present in the way he remained attentive, absorbing each moment without distraction, allowing the performance to continue without interruption or commentary. In that experience, the music became more than just sound. It became a point of connection that bypassed assumptions and reached a level of understanding that did not require explanation. And in that shared silence between observer and performer, the CEO's response reflected a quiet acknowledgement of something that had been previously unseen.